I hope you're all doing well and keeping healthy and safe wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us today. This talk is being organized by Makan. We're a Palestinian-led educational nonprofit which works to strengthen voices for Palestinian rights. This is our first virtual talk, which we're very excited about. It's part of our evening talk series, which until now is taking place every 1 to 2 months in London, where we're based. The aim of these talks is to create a space in which we bring people together to hear insights from expert speakers on issues around Palestine and human rights more broadly, and to engage in critical, thought-provoking conversations in a safe community space. So before we start, I want to share a couple of quick points and guidelines to ensure that this talk runs as smoothly as possible for everyone. In terms of the format, first of all, the talk will last 1 hour. We'll have 30 minutes of discussion between the speakers and I, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A, where we'll open the floor to you, our audience. Please do submit your questions throughout the talk. We'll be taking them throughout the talk. Just type your question in the chat bar on the right-hand side and make sure it's sent to Makan Rights in the drop-down menu. When we take your questions, we will attribute them to you. So please make sure that you have the correct name on your Zoom video by clicking on the dots in the corner of your own video and then clicking on rename in the drop-down menu. If you prefer to remain anonymous, that's fine. Just let us know when you submit your question, please. Please also ensure that you keep your microphone muted throughout the event with your video disabled. We also suggest that you right-click on a non-video participant, so a participant whose video you cannot see. Click on the dots in their video and then click on hide all non-video participants. This just makes sure that you can only see people who are speaking. So I'll just reiterate that quickly because it might not be clear to everyone. If you see a non-video participant, someone whose video you cannot see, click on the dots in the corner, click on hide all non-video participants so you can only see the people who are speaking. And then you can choose the view you prefer in the top right-hand corner of the Zoom screen by clicking on speaker view or gallery view. Also, I just want to say that this is our first online event, and like many people, we're still getting to grips with some of the technology. So please do bear with us in case we have any issues, but hopefully we won't. So today we're very excited to be joined by Nadim Nashif and Alex Kane. Nadim is a social entrepreneur and digital rights defender. He is the founder and executive director of Hamle, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media, a Palestinian digital rights organization, and co-founder of Wusul Digital Academy. Nadim joins us today from Haifa. And Alex is an independent journalist who focuses on Palestine-Israel, the politics of Palestine in the US, and civil liberties more broadly. Alex's work has appeared in the Intercept, Vice, 972 Magazine, Jewish Currents, and more. And Alex joins us today from New York. I'm Tamara Ben Halim, co-founder and director of Makan, and I'll be facilitating today's talk. We also have behind the scenes my colleagues Hussein Khalidi and Sarona Badwan. You won't see them, but they'll be the ones writing to you in the chat bar, collecting your questions, and making sure everything runs smoothly. So a brief background on our topic today before I pull our speakers in. So in this time of public emergency, with much of the world experiencing some form of lockdown and severe restrictions to movement, the tension between ensuring public security and safety on the one hand and protecting the rights of individuals on the other hand is at its greatest. Here in the UK, for example, the government is in the process of obtaining people's location data from mobile network operators, ostensibly to monitor the lockdown and help bring back British citizens who are stranded abroad. In Brussels, drones have been deployed to enforce social distancing rules. And in Palestine-Israel last month, the Israeli government unanimously approved temporary emergency powers to collect mobile phone location data and other personal information about people who tested positive for the virus or were suspected of having it, in order to track them and even have the police turn up at their doorstep to ensure that they were complying with the rules. Of course, this type of surveillance is nothing new for Palestinians who have experienced invasive surveillance efforts at the hands of the Israeli government and military for many years. So to start us off, Nadim, can you tell us a little bit more about what's happening on the ground today in Israel-Palestine in terms of surveillance? How has the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic changed the realities on the ground and people's attitudes towards surveillance? Indeed, has it changed things at all?
Thank you, Tamara, and thanks also for the team of your group for organizing this important session. And give us the opportunity to speak to your audience. Generally, obviously, this time of crisis of Corona are problematic in different aspects, but on our aspect as people who are coming from the digital rights background, it shows also lots of vulnerabilities and lots of abuse from different oppressive regimes that are using this situation in order to hold and control much more the citizens and their rights and their movements. Particularly in the Israel-Palestine context, what happened basically that the Israeli government at the beginning decided that it's going to be watching and following corona positive people, and then to see where they are. I mean, obviously through the geolocation and their mobile phones, and to see where they are in, and mainly to check if they are following the quarantine order in their houses. At the beginning, the orders were stay at your home, don't leave your home. And through checking and then knowing that certain people were not at the home, they would send police officers to the houses to check, and in different cases, if they are violating this, also to give them some kind of fines, or even in certain cases, even to arrest. Now, this started at the beginning when there was the government, obviously, as you know, the political context in Israel, that there is no elected government, and it's kind of temporary situation. And the government passed this through the laws of emergency. Basically, there are certain regulations of emergency. So this watch of corona-tested positive people through their mobiles was came through the regulations of emergency. And later on, because of petition to the Supreme Court, it was moved to the law of the Shabak, the Israeli Secret Services. And it had a lot of discussion actually in Israel when they started implementing this, not because this is the first time that the Israeli government makes surveillance. Obviously, Israel have been for decades doing surveillance for Palestinians, but because it's the first time that they spoke publicly about doing surveillance for everybody, meaning also for Jewish Israeli citizens. And the noise and the discussion around it was coming from this aspect. So this one aspect that continued until actually a couple of days ago, when the Supreme Court again, because of a petition, had a verdict that they have to change it and to have a clear law about it through the Knesset, as it was done in a bypass ways. So this is the aspect of giving the ability of the secret services to watch basically the citizens. Another aspect of this basically was on the issue of the application of the Ministry of Health. The Israeli Ministry of Health developed later on an application and called the citizens to download it on their mobile phones. And this application was supposed to be a bit more progressive, because basically it's an open source application that was developed by developers from outside of the health ministry, and was not linked directly with the security establishment, or at least they claimed so. So it was interesting, also some kind of development, because I assume also because of lots of criticism that happened to the first move. Right now, they are using both methods, though. From the one hand, the application of the Ministry of Health, and from the other hand, the Secret Service is following basically citizens and letting them know if they are coming to more nearer than 15 minutes to a corona positive tested person.
Thank you very much, Nadeem. And I mean, first maybe Nadeem, you can expand a little bit, and then I'll go to Alex, but how is this a continuation of what was already in place in terms of surveilling Palestinians? And can you mentioned the Israeli secret services, the Shabak. Can we get some context as well on the different entities at play here and the functions they serve, the army, the government, the secret service, the intelligence service, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, the whole Israeli security establishment is involved in this crisis, or managing this crisis. But in terms of surveillance, it's mainly the Israeli secret services, or known by the name of Shabak or Shin Bet. They are the one who are doing this and following basically the citizens. The point is, all the things I mentioned are more relevant to the context of Israel proper, or Israel 48 borders. And not to 67. In 67 areas, they are using also different methods. So for example, now the Kogat, or what's known as the Civic Administration of the Israeli Army in the areas of 67, meaning the West Bank and Gaza. So the part of the army that is responsible on the civic issues of the Palestinian citizens over there is not giving any services anymore for Palestinian citizens because of the corona crisis and COVID-19. So basically they are pushing the citizens to download an application of the Israeli army to their mobile phone. And we have to understand that it's a context of occupation of an army that is controlling that area of oppression, of arrests. There are decades and decades of surveillance that Palestinians suffered from. And obviously to come to a Palestinian citizen and to tell him, download an application of the army that is occupying you, it has some, we can say, small contradictions of safety. But this is being pushed, and the ones who know the reality know that Palestinian citizens need this interaction with the army because of the heavy restrictions on freedom of movement. So if you want to get a job in Jerusalem and you are living in Ramallah, you need this permit. And the context generally, I mean, if we go one step back, we know that Palestinians suffers from different kinds of surveillances. I mean, everything is being watched, and specifically in the areas of the West Bank. I mean, we are talking about facial recognition cameras that are spread out there, and not only on the checkpoints and East Jerusalem, but also in deep areas of sea. I don't know if some of you read about the issue of Anivision and Microsoft and the whole scandal that was there. Anivision is the company that developed these cameras for the Israeli army. But as a Palestinian person, you have to go through checkpoints where you are being, photographed obviously by these cameras. Your social media is being monitored by algorithms. Predictive policing software is being used. Generally, let's keep in the back of our mind that the whole infrastructure of ICT in the 67 areas is also being controlled by the Israeli authorities until now. So basically the telecommunication, the internet, the fiber cables, the phones, everything comes at the beginning to the Israeli authorities or companies, and then from there to the Palestinian ones. So even the infrastructure itself is still, till today, even after Oslo agreements and Paris Accords, still today controlled by the Israeli authorities.
Thank you, Nadeem. That's a really helpful insight. Before we move on to the next question, Alex, is there anything that you would like to add to that in terms of kind of what's already in place on surveillance of Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Nadeem delivered a really great overview. So, I mean, I would just add that, you know, as our tools of communication evolve, the Israeli surveillance state adapts. And so a lot of my reporting for the Intercept over the past couple of years in relation to this issue has been about Israel's social media surveillance. So Nadeem mentioned this briefly, and obviously, you know, Israel, as Nadeem mentioned, like the Israeli security establishment watches everything from phone calls to internet traffic, to text messages, to obviously the physical person who is traversing a checkpoint to get to work in Jerusalem or in Israel proper and in the 48 borders. And they're also watching Facebook statuses of Palestinians. So I did a lot of reporting in 2016 about Israel's ramped up use of arresting Palestinians for posting political Facebook statuses. You know, at that point, there was something like 300 people arrested. By now, I think the numbers are probably way more than that. I don't know the total number, but basically, in the West Bank, the Israeli army does have algorithms that purport to predict the likelihood of a Palestinian of committing an attack, at least according to the Israeli army. But a lot of the people that swept up, you know, never committed any crime, and simply wrote statuses, whether that's sort of anti-occupation statuses or lauding resistance to Israeli occupation, and then they get arrested on the basis of their political speech because they posted something on Facebook. And so, just to underscore that, however our communication is evolving, the surveillance state is always going to catch up and sort of monitor, particularly, of course, in the context of Palestinians when their every move is watched by the occupying authority.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex. And that's a really important point, and we'll get into it a little bit more as well in a few minutes when we talk a bit more about social media surveillance too. So let's move on. I mean, Alex, can you tell us a little bit more about the historical roots of the surveillance efforts we're seeing today, both in Palestine, Israel, but also kind of globally speaking?
Yeah, so I mean, just to sort of touch briefly on Israel Palestine, and then I can sort of get to the United States, the context that I know most. Obviously, sort of, as I mentioned, surveillance has been integral to. I mean, to be honest, surveillance, of course, is integral to every modern state, right? So I mean, Israel in this sense is not out of the ordinary. I just think it's more intensified because of the political conflict situation and the occupation that is going on. So the surveillance is intensified. Of course, Israel was born as a result of a war, and wars and states of crises produce new kinds of surveillance capabilities. So throughout Israel's history, which has always been a history filled with military occupation and war, Israel has adapted its surveillance capabilities, ranging from surveillance of telegrams from fighters on the Palestinian side or the Arab state side, to today WhatsApp messages, Facebook posts, and so on. And to bring it to the United States, I would say the history of American surveillance and Israeli surveillance is in some ways intertwined. Of course, because of the core U.S.-Israel relationship, right? So, I mean, there's so many things to touch on that I'm not going to have time. But one telling example was. And a recent example was the Edward Snowden revelations. Edward Snowden, of course, the National Security Agency whistleblower who released thousands of documents published first in The Guardian and then in the Intercept. Snowden's revelations included stuff on U.S.-Israel, the U.S.-Israel surveillance relationship. And essentially, one of the headlines out of that was that the National Security Agency, which is the United States' global sort of telecommunications and internet surveillance authority, was passing on the raw data of Americans to the Israelis. And this immediately brought up fears that Americans traveling to Israel may already be surveilled by the Israeli intelligence services, particularly, of course, Palestinians in the United States, Palestinian Americans or Arabs in the United States, and Arab Americans who are involved in Palestinian rights work, and I think this ties into a longer history of American-Israeli surveillance efforts that have a common aim, which is, of course, to monitor and eventually crush liberation movements that are working for the rights of Palestinians and more broadly, the rights of all people under repression in the world. This in the United States has ramped up after 1967. We had something called Operation Boulder, which was a program launched by President Richard Nixon following the 1972 attack in Munich on Israeli athletes that were committed by Palestinian fighters. This gave Nixon the pretext to launch a very invasive surveillance program, forcing hundreds or even thousands of Arabs to report to American visa authorities and and also it involved tapping the phone calls of many Arab American activists who were working on Palestinian rights. In fact, the first person that the National Security Agency admitted that it surveilled was an Arab American lawyer named Abdin Jabara, who is also active in the Palestinian rights movement. And so before I won't continue on for any longer, but before I end, I just want to underscore that this is the surveillance of Palestinians and the surveillance of Palestinian rights activists in the United States is a core feature of the U.S.-Israeli alliance.
Thank you, Alex. That's incredibly interesting and helpful. So as we kind of are thinking about the kind of ripple effects of Israeli surveillance beyond Palestine-Israel, Nadeem, can you help to kind of shed some light on how this surveillance technology from Israel is actually being exported to other places? So, for example, the Gulf states. Sorry, Nadeem, you're on mute.
Yes. So actually, for many years, Palestine and Palestinians were, in many cases, as a kind of a laboratory for the Israeli security establishment to try different weapons. And later on, this security establishment and different factories were exporting these weapons. And now we are talking mainly about the industry of surveillance that is basically trying and testing different softwares and different algorithms on Palestinians and exporting them. I don't know if some of you were exposed, for example, for one of an Israeli company who based in Cyprus, and they did an interview with one journalist, I think it was from Forbes, basically showing them how they can surveil a radius of 1 kilometer from a van and basically taking the data of all the mobile phones around. And later on, this company was discovered that it has the base was in Cyprus, basically because it's doing trade with Arab countries and Arab regimes from Morocco to Gulf states. We know also the company of NSO, which is an Israeli company that sold programs and technologies to Saudi Arabia. Part of it was called so-called Pegasus and other technologies that the famous case of the Saudi journalist that was killed in Istanbul, Khashoggi, by the Saudis. Basically, they used this technology to surveil him. And there are another famous case. They were also surveilling two Amnesty researchers, basically, again, using these Israeli technologies. So we know that there is a tight cooperation on this. These technologies being produced here and tested here and later on sold to many oppressive regimes. In one of the conferences I was in, and the facilitator asked this question from people coming from different continents, including Africa, Latin America. And we saw cases like from Central Africa, Mexico, and other countries who are also having these relationships with these Israeli companies and used against their citizens.
Thank you. Yes, Alex, please go ahead.
I just wanted to add in, just to add a little bit more context to what Nadeem was saying, which was a great outline of the NSO group's activities. You know, like when you, I mean, on its face, it's a little strange to think that Israel is a tiny country, right? I mean, it's the size of New Jersey, and I'm living in New York. You know, New Jersey's just across the river. It's a relatively small country, right? Like, and it's not a global superpower. It's certainly a regional superpower. But you know, the question becomes like, why is Israel the country that is always named in all of these reports that come out about surveillance technology targeting human rights activists or journalists, as in the case of Jamal Khashoggi or the Saudi activists? And so why is it that Israel, this tiny country, is connected to all of these stories? And I think one core reason why is that Israel has built up decades of experience in surveillance and in technology because they've been occupying another people. When you occupy another people, it's not so simple, right? I mean, people want their rights. Palestinians want their right to live free. And Israel's occupation, of course, prevents them from doing that. And so over the years, particularly since 1967, when the formal military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem began, Israel's surveillance capabilities have been continually refined and tested on Palestinians. So how does that get to the private sector? How does that get to the Gulf states, right? So essentially you have, particularly, let's say, the equivalent of the National Security Agency in Israel is an army unit called the Unit 8200. And Unit 8200 is essentially a feeder school into Israel's private technology and surveillance industry. So what you have is you have these 18 and 19-year-olds who are really Israelis, right? Israeli Jews, 18 and 19-year-olds. They're drafted into the army. They're really excited, and if they're particularly smart and they go to the most elite schools, they will probably be placed in units like Unit 8200, which is the unit that's devoted to surveilling Palestinians under occupation. But once they leave the army service, they take those skills and they monetize them, and they're making a lot of money. So NSO Group, actually they weren't Unit 8200 veterans, but they were Israeli army veterans, right? Celebrite Celebrite's another company that was sold. They sold technology to Bahrain, which is a very repressive regime that had faced its own unrest in 2011 during the Arab revolts. They sold Celebrite, which is a phone hacking technology, and they employ many Unit 8200 members. So all of these Israeli companies are drawing on the skills that these people learn in the Israeli army.
Yeah, I want to add to what Alex said, basically, that also we knew for decades that every Palestinian is being surveilled, I mean, in a mass way. But what also is being revealed right now, and I think the Israeli government is feeling enough confidence because of the corona crisis, is also the issue of the tool. The tool, basically, it's a huge database in Israel that is basically collecting all information of any kind of telecommunication or internet or phone since the beginning of the second Intifada and on. So it's almost about 20 years that they are collecting in a mass, because if we thought at the beginning that there are certain individuals whose the security establishment is interested in them for that or the reason, it's not the case. The case is it's a mass surveillance of all citizens, including Jewish Israelis. And it was interesting to see, I mean, the investigative report was published in Yediot Achronot, the leading Israeli newspaper, by Ronen Bergman, a leading Israeli well-known journalist who actually writes from time to time also to the New York Times. And now, obviously, this piece wouldn't be published without the military censorship giving the okay for them to publish it, because as you know, in Israel, the military censorship, anything related to security has to go and to be scanned by it. And from here, we learn basically that everybody, again, like it's not only about Palestinians, but in the last 2 decades, it's also about Jewish Israeli citizens who are also in a massive way, or everybody is being basically surveyed, all text, all phone calls, any kind of browsing history of pages, the whole issue of geolocation is being collected somewhere, and then if needed at time they would go back. So basically this database can answer if Nadim Nashif on Friday 19th of January 2007, which basically at the, let's say at time of 11 a.m. where I was exactly through the geolocation of was, and which kind of text message I sent that time, etc., etc. So it's a mass violation of any kind of privacy, if any privacy left at all.
Thank you both so much. That's incredibly helpful to understand both kind of the relationship between kind of the army, the secret services, and that feeder kind of school that Alex was talking about, and of course kind of the sheer reach of Israeli intelligence surveillance efforts. So just before I move on to my final question, I just want to send a reminder to our audience members to please do submit to us. We've had a good number of questions, but if anyone else has anything that they would like to ask, either of our speakers, please do submit your questions in the chat box on the right-hand side, and we'll endeavor to take as many of your questions as possible. So my last question to both of you, Nadeem and Alex, it's a little bit of a two-pronged question, but it's kind of just to touch a little bit more on what Alex had initially been talking about in terms of the surveillance of Palestine activists. Both in Palestine-Israel and, for example, in the US. We also have examples of that here in the UK too. So whoever would like to take the question first, can you tell us a bit more about how these technologies are being used to spy on Palestine activists? And then as a follow-up, kind of specifically, and maybe this is a question to Nadeem, because obviously Hamle has done a huge amount of work on this, more specifically about the relationship between the Israeli state and social media companies like Facebook, and what is the role of companies like Facebook in surveilling Palestinians. So Alex, do you want to maybe go first, and then Nadeem can tackle the second half?
Yes.
Thank you.
In Palestine, of course, activists and political thinkers and social media sort of posters and writers are a major target of the Israeli surveillance state, and in the United States, has also been the case that Palestinian rights activists have come under pernicious forms of surveillance, and also similarly, like what we were talking about before with the involvement of the private sector, the private surveillance industry in the targeting of activists from places from Saudi Arabia to Europe to the United States. There's also the involvement of private actors in the United States as well when it comes to the surveillance of Palestinian rights activists. So there are private, Ronan Farrow of the New Yorker wrote a very revealing piece a year and a half ago or so about the surveillance of Palestinian rights activists in the United States. And this was actually both digital and physical surveillance, sort of following basically ex-Israeli intelligence officials and agents employed by an Israeli company, surveilling and compiling dossiers on major Palestinian rights activists like Rebecca Volkomerson, the former executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace, and Hatem Bazian, who is a professor at the University of California, also a major Palestinian rights activist. And they were spied on by this private Israeli company that was founded by Israeli intelligence veterans. But it's not just private actors, it's also, say, the FBI in the United States. The FBI has a long-standing interest in surveilling Palestinian rights activists because they view Palestinian rights activists as part of the broader left and a part of broader movements for liberation. And so this has a long history, as I mentioned, post-1967 with Richard Nixon. But I did some reporting for the Intercept about how the FBI had recently interrogated some Palestinian student activists, people active on their campuses for Palestinian rights. And when they were brought into interrogation, some of them were questioned on the basis of a dossier compiled by an organization called Canary Mission, which is a sort of another form of surveillance. The Canary Mission is a sort of organization the extent of its funding is a little murky, but it's been funded by mainstream American Jewish foundations. But they basically compile dossiers and they do their own essentially surveillance of social media profiles of Palestinians and Palestinian rights activists, and they compile dossiers and publicly put them on a website to sort of name and shame them away from doing the work that they're doing. And so the FBI was using this website's profiles, which are often inaccurate and racist, to interrogate these activists. And so that was just one example of how private actors and the federal government are collaborating in their efforts to surveil Palestinian rights activists.
Thank you, Alex. Nadim.
I would add to that there is this side of surveillance, but there is the active side, taking different strategies and tactics. Basically, we call it the war on the Palestinian content, because there is a very coordinated effort to delete and to take down Palestinian content from the social media, or to from one hand. So you see, there is the side of the cooperation that's happening between the cyber unit that is based in the Israeli Ministry of Justice, that it basically give requests to Facebook. Let's say, I'm mentioning Facebook because most of the Palestinians and actually also the Israelis are in Facebook. So most of the reports that they are doing and the takedowns are going to that direction. So basically we know that they, in a systematic way, watch or surveil the Palestinian content through different algorithms, keywords, and then they report it to certain unit in Facebook and ask them to take it down on the background that it's incitement, calling for violence. And obviously the definition of violence and incitement by the Israelis is very vague and very broad. So anybody that would write anything saying, for example, the occupation should go down, we should protect Al-Aqsa Mosque, or any kind of these sentences, this is also part of the violence according to their definitions. And unfortunately, Facebook is quite cooperative with them. We know that the percent of cooperation between Facebook and actually most of the social media companies almost reached 90% of the Israeli requests. And we know basically that the last year, Adala Center managed to get this statistics. Basically, they had almost 14,000 requests. So the Israeli cyber unit had more than 14,000 requests to Facebook to take downs of social media content. Each request has hundreds and sometimes even more of specific requests. So you can imagine how much they are putting pressure and trying to take down different Palestinian content, including pages, specific posts, etc. But this is like the official effort. There is a coordinated unofficial effort, or they claim to be like more kind of popular or civic ones, that include different organized groups, including an application that is called ACT-IL. Another initiative is called 4IL, and similar groups that are financed by individuals and by the Israeli Strategic Affairs Ministry, basically organizing people to report. So basically you subscribe to this application, you get this notification telling you that this Palestinian page now uploaded this picture on Instagram, you need to go and to report it. So obviously from the side of the platform, when like hundreds and thousands of requests of takedown for certain picture, the platform would take it down and check it, and in many cases will put it back, but this will take few days or weeks until they check and come back to you. So this is a very coordinated effort on taking down the Palestinian content, but this is not the only tactic. It's also like about smear campaigns against Palestinian civic society figures and human rights defenders like Sha'wan Jabarin and others. Like real campaigns, sponsored campaigns, especially in Europe, and I guess it was also probably similar in also in the US by a company called Kela David and other companies who are getting their sponsorship from the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and the Minister Gilad Erdan. So it's a very coordinated effort and lots of pressure that is happening on from the Israeli side, official and non-official, on Facebook and the rest of the companies. While on the other side, the Palestinian side, there is hardly any kind of coordinated reporting effort that is happening. And it does not stop right there. There is lots of Palestinian NGOs are suffering from these kind of fights on Wikipedia. So saying that this is an organization is kind of affiliated with the Palestinian left, so it's a terror organization affiliated, etc., and trying to reach out to their funders and to smear them. So this is an ongoing tactics that are being used in the past few years, and they are just growing and being more intensive and more.
Thank you so much for that, Nadeem. So we have a lot of great questions coming in from people, so I'm gonna start taking a couple of those and as many as we can in the next 20 minutes or so. So we have a question here from Ramzi Dabbar, and his question is, are there any other particularly notable occurrences of surveillance besides Nixon's program and Edward Snowden, the Edward Snowden leak, over the course of the history of Israel that are important to consider? Whoever would like to jump on that one.
I am assuming that the question is perhaps focused on the American context. I mean, there are a lot. So, but a couple things spring to mind. So one is that the Intercept, as well, actually another journalist and a lawyer by the name of Chip Gibbons. If you Google the Intercept surveillance Palestine Solidarity Group, there's an excellent report that he just did last week or 2 weeks ago about the files that he obtained from the Federal Bureau of Investigation into their investigation into an organization called the International Solidarity Movement. So the ISM is a sort of global global group of people who go to Palestine and work with Palestinian organizations on various activist causes, whether that's documenting Israeli settler violence. And the FBI had placed many figures associated with the ISM under surveillance. They'd opened terrorism investigations into the ISM. Similarly, the FBI raided in 2000, I believe it was 11, they raided the homes of over a dozen, or maybe even, I think it was actually 23, if I'm remembering correctly, the homes of a number of Palestinian rights figures in the Midwest of the United States, so Illinois and Indiana and various states. Basically, they were investigating these Palestinian rights activists for allegations that they were tied to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is the leftist Palestinian political faction, which is on the State Department list of foreign terrorist organizations and such. It is illegal for Americans to give them any form of support. And so the FBI raided their homes, placed them, requested their presence at a grand jury. They all refused. Eventually, this morphed into a couple of politically motivated prosecutions, like the prosecution of a woman named Rasmia Odeh, who was eventually deported from the United States. I won't get into all of the details of that, but that is one. And then just finally, I'll end with that there's also sort of historical efforts by organizations, Israel lobby organizations like the Anti-Defamation League. The Anti-Defamation League is today, I think, in a lot of mainstream and liberal circles seen as a sort of expert on documenting white nationalist violence, but they were also an Israel lobby organization, and they spied on Arab Americans, including the the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. In the early 1990s, they eventually settled from a lawsuit and said that they would never spy on such activists again. But the Anti-Defamation League spied on people who were working for the rights of Arab Americans and Palestinians. So those are just kind of some of the things that come to mind. I mean, there are many other specific cases that we can drill down into.
Thank you. Yeah, and Nadeem, please go ahead.
Maybe one case that it's an interesting case to see, because there were these testimonies from Israeli soldiers who were part of the elite unit that Alex mentioned earlier, 8200, which is a telecommunications surveillance elite. And basically they were surveilling Palestinian LGBTQ from Gaza and recording their talks and their chat, and later on using this to basically for extortion, to make them collaborators for the Israeli secret services, and threatening them either that they would be cooperative with them and giving them information about Hamas, or that they will send this information, the private chat, to the Hamas authority or to their families and threatening them in this way.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we have another question here from Karen Weitzberg. Her question is, does international law have any role to play in limiting Israel's use of surveillance technology? I'm leaving it open, whoever wants to jump on that one.
I'm not expert in international law, so it's difficult for me to answer.
Alex, do you have anything that you might want to add on that?
That's a good question. I'm going to say I'm not totally familiar with the international legal frameworks around this. I will say that I do know that there's, in general, if you look at like the UN's international conventions on political rights, that there are certain rights that that they outline, right to free speech, the right to privacy. And those are all sort of basic rights that are outlined in international treaties that the majority of the world has signed on to, and that unfortunately, just a general point about international law in Israel-Palestine is that the international community has not imposed any consequences on Israel for its violations, of very blatant violations of international law, and that's in large part because, of course, the United States, the world's most powerful actor, has backed Israel in these international legal forums where they would be monitored and perhaps punished.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Okay, and so since we're on this kind of on a roll with kind of the more international aspect of these surveillance efforts, I'd like to take this question from, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, from Khodar from Argentina. Khodar asks, would you both be able to expand on Israeli surveillance cooperation, in particular with Latin American countries and governments? And then following that, what lines of research would you like to see further developed by journalists and researchers based in South America? Alex, do you want to jump on that? And then Nadim, if he has anything to add?
So Israel, and like, it's sort of, so Israel is a regional superpower, and the United States, one of the United States' key military allies, and as such, the United States and Israel work towards joint aims when it comes to, say, Latin America, right? Latin America being close to the United States, but Israel has certain interests in Latin America that align with the United States, that they want Latin American states to remain in their camp, in the sort of international relations. And so Israel has a long history, of course, of arming the most repressive regimes in Latin America. The weapons trade, right? The weapons trade and surveillance trade are very much linked, right? Surveillance, when you sell surveillance tools, it's a weapon, right? It's a type of weapon that can be used in warfare and in the repression of people. And so Israel has long sold billions of dollars worth of weapons to regimes like Guatemala and El Salvador, much like the United States was also selling them weapons. So that's the kind of general context that I wanted to begin. And then if you look at, say, a number of Israeli companies, you also see that they have sold their own surveillance weapons to these countries. Colombia is one company that brings to mind. In 2000, in a couple of years ago, I don't want to say the wrong date, but a couple of years ago, or maybe a decade ago, there was some good reporting by an organization called Privacy International, which is a global privacy watchdog, that they documented how Israeli companies had sold to Colombia surveillance equipment that would enable them to vacuum up a lot of data of cell phones in Colombia, as part of, Colombian government justified it as part of their war against the FARC, the sort of leftist group that the Colombian authorities have been battling for many years in the sort of 3-decades-long civil war there. That was one sort of prominent example that pops up in my head as how Israeli surveillance companies have collaborated with countries in Latin America.
Thank you. That's really helpful, Alex. And then, I mean, from either of you or both of you, what lines of research might you like to see further developed by journalists or researchers who are based in South America?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot, there's a lot that we don't know. I mean, I think like who are the companies that police agencies and intelligence agencies in Latin America are buying from? I would imagine that some of them are Israeli companies, and so what companies are there? So I mean, a lot of this is done in secret, and so it takes good investigative reporting with the sources in these agencies to be able to ferret out who these governments are buying from.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that basically also that there was a kind of mapping that was done by Citizens Lab in Canada, an organization in Canada, basically, that was showing also how the group of NSO, Pegasus, and other technologies were also sold to the Mexican government and to other governments in the globe, but they were also active in Latin America, and I think it would be interesting. And as far as I remember, there was also a lawsuit against from some Mexican lawyers against the company. So also following up on these and exposing them, I think would be also important.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you both for that. And kind of just maybe to expand a little bit more on that, Nadeem, could you help explain kind of how, we have a question here, sorry, from Rohan. Could you help explain how Israel's surveillance practices are internationalized, not only through the export of surveillance tech, but also in terms of the norms around their use? So for example, how does Israel influence how other states use these tools, like the training of foreign security forces, for example?
I mean, obviously there are cooperations that are happening with different security establishments in different countries, including things that are happening not only in oppressive regimes, but some of the European governments, for example, Israel or Israeli bodies were trying to sell them these kind of predictive policing softwares that they developed on Palestinians, or different algorithms that were scanning Palestinian social media under the framing this that we're fighting terror. And at that time it was ISIS in Europe and attacks from the ISIS side, and trying to package this as the Palestinians, Hamas, ISIS, that everything is the same. And you should take our experience and implement it in your area. So this always happening. I mean, it was in the past and still right now. There is also a lot of effort from the Israeli side to put, because also the social media companies are facing lots of pressure from Western governments in several years to put these kind of anti-terrorism act and the conversation of how to fight terrorism and extremism inside the social media. So from the Israeli government, they're always pushing that the Palestinian issues, Palestinian cause, to frame it under this framework and to add more keywords and personalities and organizations and political parties also under part of this conversation. And this is becoming more and more problematic, because the result of that is basically certain keywords about Palestinian political fractions you cannot even write now in social media, because you would write like Hamas twice, the post would disappear and you will get banned from the social media. And this is case in Hamas, but there are also other cases. So for example, there was a guy whose son is named Qassam, and when he was writing posts about his son, the post disappeared, because Qassam, as we know, is the militia that belong to Hamas. So even, I mean, the artificial intelligence that they are using is not very sophisticated also to make the distinctions between different things. And sometimes you have also even these kind of weird, funny cases.
Thank you, Nadeem. Alex, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Nope.
Thank you. Okay, and I'm gonna take one final question, which has actually been asked by several people, so I want to make sure I get to it. So people have asked, you know, how have Palestinians so far been kind of resisting or trying to resist these surveillance efforts, and what can we do, kind of from our parts, whether here, the rest of Europe, the States, Latin America, wherever else, the Middle East? What can we do to also resist these efforts and protect ourselves? Alex, do you want to take that first, and then Nadeem?
Well, I think so. I will. So Nadeem would be the knowledgeable one on the how Palestinians themselves are resisting this. But what I will say is that you know, I think one thing that comes to mind is sort of, I mean, as a journalist, one thing that journalists should be doing is sort of doing their best to document the Israeli surveillance companies that are selling to government. So I mean, you know, depends on your privacy laws and your laws about transparency on government contracts. Obviously, that varies government by government. But in the United States, there has been good reporting done on, you know, what police agencies have bought technology from Celebrite, which is the iPhone cracking technology that I mentioned. You know, the police, you know, local state police agency contracts are public. And so people have documented that kind of stuff. So, I mean, the first thing that you need is information. And so that's one thing. And the other thing that I want to mention is that, you know, the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a sort of American Jewish organization for Palestinian rights, recently had a significant moment when Nadeem mentioned earlier the controversy about AnyVision. So Jewish Voice for Peace targeted Microsoft because Microsoft had given seed funding to AnyVision, and AnyVision was developing this facial recognition technology that was targeting Palestinians at military checkpoints. And so Jewish Voice for Peace launched a campaign calling on Microsoft to withdraw its investment. They successfully got an investigation, investigation that Microsoft started on themselves, and eventually Microsoft said that it would no longer be funding and that would pull its money out. So these sorts of activist campaigns are ongoing, and that, you know, people are turning the spotlight onto these companies that are complicit in Israel's surveillance.
Thank you so much, Alex. And Nadeem, it would be great to hear from you on a final note as to how Palestinians have historically and today are resisting these surveillance efforts.
Yeah, so basically there's a more and more awareness between especially young Palestinians on the need to be more kind of careful on the social media. People are, for example, like changing the names, not having the full name. Sometimes people don't use anymore their pictures in the profile. It's also about knowing different steps that can also help in having more privacy. So for example, using VPN and more encrypted emails, different steps in digital security that are more and more. And I think generally organizations and individuals in Palestine are more and more using and taking these trainings to be more aware about how can protect their privacy in a better way. We have to take into consideration that in the Palestinian context, it's not only Israel, it's also lots of people sometimes who are not in the line of the Palestinian Authority, so they are also being watched on the side. People in Gaza who are resisting Hamas policies are also being watched. And one of the researches that we did actually in the end of last year shows that also like 2/3 of the Palestinian youth are afraid even to speak politics anymore on social media, because you're having so much pressure that is going towards people. It's from the Israeli government and the Israeli occupation army and the security intelligence, but then you are also having the PA and you're having Hamas government and you're having the social media companies themselves that are also watching you and taking down. So it's a heavy pressure on many of the youth that many of them actually either quit social media or not in Facebook anymore, or changing their name, changing their presence there. The other side of it is having these kind of campaigns against the social media companies and trying to make them to also change their policies and having more transparent and clear policies toward all of content, and not to have digital discrimination as it is happening right now.
Thank you so much, Nadeem. And for anyone who's not already familiar with Hamle's work, Hamle with an English 7, AMLEH, I would really encourage you to check them out because there's all the information there in terms of reports and campaigns on protecting Palestinian digital rights. So we have reached the end of our talk today. Thank you, first of all, so much to our speakers for giving us their time and their incredibly important and fascinating insights. I've learned so much from both of you today, so thank you. I hope others feel the same. And thanks to every one of you who's joined us today for our first ever online talk. It's been great to have you. Our next talk is taking place very soon, next Wednesday, the 6th of May, and we'll be talking about the Palestinian feminist movement, Tal'at, within a broader context of anti-colonialism and the ongoing Nakba. You'll be receiving an email from us in the next day or two, which will include a link for you to register for the talk if you would like to join us then. So we hope to see you there, and thank you so much. Take care.